Did you know a wrong spouse choice in the Middle Ages could cost you everything? Your family's honor, your wealth, even your life. For people living between the 5th and 15th centuries, marriage was no simple love story. It was a high-stakes game where society watched every move. Here's how they judged. Number 11. Personal reputation and morality. In the medieval world, a person's reputation was often as valuable as their land or their lineage, sometimes even more so, especially when it came to choosing a spouse. Society's judgment on an individual's personal morality could make or break a marriage prospect, setting the stage for either a prosperous union or a life of social exclusion. For women, this judgment centered heavily on their perceived purity and virginity, a concept that held immense weight in a time when a family's honor was intrinsically tied to the chastity of its daughters. A young woman's unblemished reputation was her most vital asset, a jewel she carried into any potential marriage negotiation. Should even a whisper of scandal or impropriety attach itself to her name, her worth in the marriage market plummeted, often to the point where even families of lower standing would hesitate to accept her into their fold. This was not just about personal virtue. It was about the assurance of legitimate heirs, a matter of paramount importance for inheritance and the continuation of family lines, particularly among the nobility. Public nature of medieval life meant that rumors spread like wildfire through villages and towns. A fleeting indiscretion, a perceived dalliance, or even false accusations could follow a person for years, casting a long shadow over their future. A maiden who was seen alone with a man too frequently, or who had a reputation for being overly bold or independent, might find herself ostracized. Her family, deeply invested in maintaining its good name, would suffer a collective shame that could impact their own social standing and their ability to arrange advantageous marriages for other children. For example, a noble family in England, such as the Fitzalands or Percys, would guard their daughters' reputations with fierce vigilance, understanding that a stain on one member could tarnish the entire lineage. If a daughter, even through unfortunate circumstances, was suspected of illicit relations, her dowry would likely be significantly reduced, or she might be forced into a less desirable marriage, perhaps to an older widower or a man of lower status, simply to avoid the public spectacle of her remaining unwed. In some extreme cases, a woman might be sent to a convent, not out of religious calling, but to save the family from further dishonor. Men, too, faced judgment regarding their personal morality, though the standards were often different and less strictly applied than for women. A man's reputation for honesty, bravery, and piety was important, especially for those seeking to rise in the ranks of knighthood or local governance. However, a man's sexual history, while not entirely ignored, carried far less stigma than a woman's. A man known for frequenting brothels or having illegitimate children might still find a suitable wife if he possessed wealth, land, or power. Yet, a reputation for extreme cruelty, dishonesty, or disloyalty, particularly towards his lord or his church, could certainly hinder his marital prospects. A knight who had betrayed his oath, or a merchant who was known for swindling, would find it difficult to secure a match with a respectable family, as such a union might expose the wife's family to risk or dishonor. For instance, if a man from a minor gentry family in France, say the de Lusignans, was known to be a compulsive gambler who squandered his inheritance, noble families would hesitate to allow their daughters to marry him, fearing ruin. They might instead seek a husband who, though perhaps not as wealthy, had a reputation for being prudent and honorable. The Church played a significant role in defining and enforcing these moral judgments. It emphasized chastity before marriage and fidelity within it, while confessions and penance offered a path to redemption for moral transgressions. The public memory of such acts could persist. Cases of fornication, adultery, or even incest were brought before ecclesiastical courts, and the public shaming or penance prescribed for such offenses would permanently mark the individuals involved. A woman who was found to have committed adultery, for example, might be publicly humiliated, stripped of her dowry, and cast out by her husband, effectively ruining any chance of another reputable marriage. Her children, if her husband could prove they were not his, might even be disinherited, highlighting the far-reaching consequences of such moral failings. Furthermore, the legal system, intertwined with societal norms, reinforced these judgments. Laws around illegitimacy, for instance, severely curtailed the rights of children born out of wedlock. Such children, often bearing the stigma of their parents' perceived immorality, were generally excluded from inheriting titles, lands, or significant wealth. This meant that families were always on guard to ensure the legitimacy of their heirs, making a potential spouse's moral standing and the certainty of their lineage a critical factor. The infamous case of William the Conqueror, born out of wedlock, highlights the struggle even a powerful individual faced against the label of the bastard, a judgment on his parents' relationship that continued to follow him throughout his life despite his immense military success and his eventual claim to the English throne. The social pressure to marry someone of good reputation, someone whose past was above reproach, was not merely a matter of snobbery. It was a matter of practical survival, ensuring the stability, legitimacy, and continuity of family and lineage in a world where honor was everything. Number 10. Political implications. In the intricate tapestry of medieval Europe, where kingdoms rose and fell and alliances shifted like the tides, marriage was far more than a personal bond. It was a potent political instrument. A royal or noble marriage could redraw maps, cement peace treaties, or ignite wars, making the choice of a spouse a matter of national and dynastic survival. Society, particularly the ruling classes and their numerous vassals, judged these unions with an almost obsessive scrutiny, understanding that the implications stretched far beyond the wedding feast. For reigning monarchs and powerful lords, a marriage was an extension of foreign policy, a means to acquire land, strengthen borders, or neutralize rivalries without the costly bloodshed of open warfare. When Edward I of England sought to solidify his control over Scotland, he famously arranged for his son, the future Edward II, to marry Margaret, the Maid of Norway, who was the infant queen of Scotland. Her untimely death prevented this union, but the very attempt reveals the strategic depth of such political marriages. The loss of a bride could plunge nations into uncertainty, as happened in this case, contributing to the escalation of the wars of Scottish independence. The judgment on a politically motivated marriage often focused on the balance of power it created. Was the alliance strong enough to deter enemies? Did it bring sufficient wealth or military aid? Did it give one side too much influence over the other? For instance, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women of the 12th century, first to King Louis VII of France, and then famously to Henry II of England, radically altered the political landscape of Western Europe. Her second marriage brought her vast territories in southwestern France under English control, creating a formidable Angevin empire that dwarfed the lands directly controlled by the French king. This union was judged by the French as a strategic disaster, leading to centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. Society, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant, felt the ripple effects of such unions as they dictated peace, war, and the flow of trade. Succession was another critical political implication. Dynasties depended on heirs, and a marriage was judged heavily on its potential to produce legitimate children, especially sons. The pressure on royal couples to produce an heir was immense, and the failure to do so could lead to a succession crisis, civil war, or the extinction of a ruling house. The marriage of Henry VIII of England to Catherine of Aragon, for example, was initially celebrated as a union that brought England closer to powerful Spain. However, their inability to produce a surviving male heir eventually led to Henry's desperate measures to annul the marriage, triggering the English Reformation and profound political and religious upheaval. The society of the time, from the Privy Council to the common folk, watched and judged this marriage, understanding that the future of the realm hinged on its fruitfulness. Marriages were also used to bring rival factions or warring families together, to heal old wounds and forge new bonds of loyalty. A lord might marry his daughter to the son of a neighboring lord with whom he had a long-standing feud, hoping to transform animosity into kinship. Such alliances, while often successful, were judged on the sincerity of the parties involved and whether the peace truly held. If the marriage did not quell the rivalry, it could be seen as a failure, potentially escalating tensions further, as the personal betrayal would compound the political one. For instance, the marriage of John de Navarre to Philip IV of France in the late 13th century helped to unite the Kingdom of Navarre with the French crown, a union that significantly expanded French power and influence. Such unions were strategic masterstrokes, praised for their foresight and benefits to the realm. On the flip side, marrying the wrong person could have catastrophic political consequences. Marrying someone with a weak claim to their own lands, or someone from a disreputable or declining family, could undermine a dynasty's legitimacy and strength. Marrying outside one's social or political class was almost unheard of for royalty and high nobility, as it would dilute the purity of the bloodline and weaken their claims to power, which were often based on ancestral right. Queen or king marrying a commoner would have been politically unthinkable and universally condemned, as it would challenge the very hierarchical structure upon which medieval power rested. Such a union would have been seen as a sign of weakness, a betrayal of royal duty, and an invitation for rival claimants to challenge the throne. The rare instances of such a union, like that of Elizabeth Woodville to Edward IV of England, a marriage not arranged for political gain but seemingly for affection, caused immense controversy and destabilized the realm, contributing to the Wars of the Roses. Society, from the powerful magnates to the ordinary people, understood that these were not just personal choices but matters of state, and they judged them with the weight of the realm's future in the balance. Number 9. Proximity and kinship. Consanguinity. In the medieval world, the definition of family stretched far beyond what modern society might consider immediate relatives, and this expansive view profoundly influenced who could marry whom. The Church, in its pervasive influence over daily life, established strict rules regarding consanguinity, or kinship by blood and affinity, kinship by marriage. These rules were not just suggestions, they were canon law, heavily enforced, and a marriage that violated them was judged as illegitimate, potentially leading to its annulment and severe social repercussions. Society, guided by the Church's teachings, viewed marriage between close relatives with deep suspicion, believing it to be morally corrupt, potentially leading to physical deformities in offspring and a spiritual affront to God. Prohibitions could extend to the 7th degree of kinship, meaning one could not marry anyone with whom they shared a common great-great-great-great-grandparent. This seemingly distant connection often proved incredibly complex to track, especially among the nobility, who frequently intermarried to maintain their power and wealth within a limited pool of suitable partners. The elaborate family trees of aristocratic houses became a labyrinth of interconnected lines, making it increasingly difficult to find a spouse who was not somehow related. To marry someone within the prohibited degrees without a special dispensation from the Pope was considered incestuous. Such a union, if discovered and challenged, could be dissolved, rendering any children born from it illegitimate. This would mean that the children could not inherit titles, lands, or wealth, creating immense instability for noble families whose very existence depended on legitimate succession. For example, during the reign of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II of England, their marriage was eventually questioned on grounds of consanguinity because they were distantly related through common ancestors from the early Norman dukes. Although the marriage was not dissolved on these grounds, the possibility of such a challenge always lingered, a constant threat to the legitimacy of their heirs and the stability of the Angevin Empire. The Church's rules were not always consistently applied or easy to enforce, and their strictness could fluctuate over time and by region. However, the underlying societal judgment against such unions remained strong. Peasants and common folk, who often had less elaborate genealogical records, might inadvertently marry a distant cousin. If this was discovered, they too could face public penance, their marriage potentially invalidated, and their children stigmatized. The village community, guided by the local priest, would view such a marriage with unease, seeing it as a defiance of divine and natural order. Stories and superstitions often circulated about the physical defects or misfortunes that befell children of such unions, further reinforcing the societal taboos. However, paradoxically, for powerful royal and noble families, these strict rules also presented an opportunity for political maneuver. A king or a lord who wished to rid himself of an inconvenient spouse, or to prevent a rival from marrying into a powerful family, could bring a charge of consanguinity against the marriage. They would commission genealogists and legal scholars to scour family records, tracing lineages back centuries to find a distant common ancestor, thereby manufacturing a legal reason for annulment. This was a common tactic in medieval divorce proceedings, as actual divorce was not permitted by the Church. For example, the infamous case of King Louis XII of France, who sought to marry Anne of Brittany, the widow of his predecessor King Charles VIII, provides a clear illustration. To do so, he needed to annul his existing marriage to Jeanne of France. He successfully argued to the Pope that his marriage to Jeanne was invalid due to consanguinity and because he had been forced into it. Pope, recognizing the political expediency of the union with Anne, which would bring Brittany into the French crown, granted the annulment, demonstrating how the rules could be bent for powerful figures. The very need for papal dispensations highlighted the rigidity of the rules and the societal pressure to conform. When a powerful family truly needed to marry within a prohibited degree for political or economic reasons, they would appeal to the Pope, offering lavish gifts or political favors in return for an exemption. Such dispensations were expensive and difficult to obtain, reserved primarily for the highest echelons of society, treating that, while the rules were universal, their application and circumvention were deeply stratified. For the vast majority of people, however, the judgment against marrying within forbidden degrees of kinship was absolute, a deeply ingrained social and religious taboo that shaped marital choices and family structures across the entire medieval world, ensuring that tracing one's lineage was not merely a matter of pride, but a matter of legality or world. Number 8. Consent, or lack thereof. The concept of consent in medieval marriage was a complex and often contradictory affair, caught between the emerging doctrines of the Church and the deeply entrenched power of families and feudal lords. While the Church increasingly emphasized the importance of mutual consent between the bride and groom for a marriage to be sacramentally valid, societal practice, particularly among the nobility and wealthy merchants, frequently prioritized family strategy and economic gain above individual choice. Society, therefore, often judged a marriage based not just on whether consent was given, but on whether it was appropriately given, meaning with the full approval of the parents or guardians. A marriage without parental consent was considered scandalous, an act of defiance that could bring shame and disinheritance regardless of the Church's evolving stance on individual will. For the vast majority of medieval people, especially the powerful marriages, were arranged. A young woman might be betrothed in childhood, with her consent implicitly assumed or, more often, entirely irrelevant. She was expected to accept her family's choice, understanding that her union was a strategic tool to secure alliances, wealth, or power for her lineage. The judgment from society in these cases was typically positive, seeing the arrangement as a pragmatic and responsible decision by the family. For example, a young daughter of a baron might be promised to the son of a neighboring count to end a long-standing land dispute or to bolster forces against a common enemy. Her personal feelings or lack thereof were considered secondary to the greater good of the family and its political standing. If she resisted, she faced severe familial and societal disapproval, potentially being disinherited or even sent to a convent as a means of control. However, the Church did uphold the idea that for a marriage to be truly binding in the eyes of God, the individuals involved must freely exchange vows. This led to fascinating legal and social conflicts. A couple who truly loved each other but lacked parental approval might elope and secretly exchange vows before witnesses. Such a clandestine marriage, while sacramentally valid in the eyes of the Church, was legally and socially perilous. Society heavily condemned such actions as a breach of familial authority, a theft of parental prerogative. Families might pursue the couple, seeking annulment on grounds of coercion or lack of proper ceremony, or more drastically disown the children and cut off any inheritance. A famous historical example is the secret marriage of Agnes of Merania to Philip Augustus of France. This union, entered into after Philip had repudiated his previous wife, was initially valid in the eyes of the Church through their vows, but was condemned by Pope Innocent III due to its bigamous nature and the lack of proper process. The societal judgment was harsh, contributing to a prolonged period of political and religious conflict. For daughters of powerful families, resisting an arranged marriage could be extremely difficult. Stories of women confined to towers, threatened or beaten for refusing a match, are not uncommon in medieval chronicles. Yet, some did resist. The judgment on these women was often split. Some might pity them for their plight, while others would view them as disobedient or selfish, undermining the family's honor. For men, the pressure to conform was also significant, but they generally had more avenues for escape or influence. A son could with great difficulty refuse an arranged match if he could demonstrate a compelling reason, such as a pre-existing vow or a severe physical impediment, but he would still face immense familial disappointment and potential disinheritance. The legal age of consent, though often much lower than modern standards, around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, was also a point of judgment. A marriage between two very young children, even if arranged, could be challenged later if one of them claimed they had not truly consented or were too young to understand the implications. Such cases were rare but did occur, highlighting the tension between the legal and spiritual dimensions of consent. Ultimately, while the Church introduced the concept of individual will into the marriage contract, the overwhelming societal judgment in the medieval period remained firmly with the family. A marriage was not just about the individuals. It was about the collective interests of the lineage, and any choice that defied this established order, regardless of personal sentiment, was met with disapproval and often severe consequences, leaving individuals to navigate a delicate balance between their own desires and the demands of their world. Number 7. Previous marriages and offspring. In medieval society, the marital status of a person's past, particularly whether they had been married before, and if they had offspring from those unions, heavily influenced their desirability as a spouse, and how society judged their suitability. For widows and widowers, their previous experience in marriage, their financial standing, and the presence of children created a complex set of considerations that could either be advantageous or a significant hindrance. A widow, especially a wealthy one, could be a highly sought-after prize. If her first husband had been a man of means, she would typically inherit a dower which was a portion of his estate, often 1/3, designated for her support. This dower provided her with financial independence and made her an attractive prospect for a new husband looking to improve his own economic standing. A young, childless widow with a substantial dower was particularly desirable, as she brought wealth without the complication of existing heirs who might dilute future inheritances. For instance, a wealthy merchant's widow in Bruges, having inherited a significant portion of his trading assets, would attract suitors from ambitious younger merchants or even minor gentry eager to expand their fortunes. However, society also judged a widow on her ability to manage her deceased husband's estate and her overall comportment. A woman who was seen as wasteful or flighty, even if wealthy, might be deemed less desirable than a prudent and capable manager. Presence of children from a previous marriage was a major factor for judgment. For a widower, taking on a new wife who brought children into the household could be seen as an immediate expansion of his family, providing more hands for labor or potential alliances. However, it also meant more mouths to feed, and the new wife's dower might be used to support these children, not just her new husband's family. For a widow, bringing children to a new marriage could be a significant obstacle. Her new husband would become their stepfather, and while he might be legally obligated to support them, there was often tension over inheritance. His own children, if he had any, or any children born of the new union, would compete for resources and land with the stepchildren. This often led to difficult domestic situations and resentment. A woman with several older children, especially sons, might find it challenging to secure a second marriage because of these inheritance complexities. For instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, after her divorce from Louis VII of France, brought two daughters from her previous marriage to her new union with Henry II of England. While her vast lands were the primary attraction, the existence of her daughters from a previous marriage meant that their future marriages also had to be considered in the complex web of Anglo-French dynastic politics. The age of the widow or widower was also crucial. A young widow was more likely to remarry, especially if she was still capable of bearing children, a primary expectation of any medieval marriage. An older widow past childbearing years might be sought after for her wealth, experience, or political connections, rather than for her ability to produce heirs. Similarly, an older widower might seek a younger wife to bear him sons, perpetuating his lineage. Society judged these choices based on pragmatism and necessity. A marriage where the woman was too old to conceive was less ideal if the goal was to produce children, but perfectly acceptable if the goal was to consolidate wealth or companionship. The circumstances of the previous spouse's death also played a role in societal judgment. If a previous spouse had died under suspicious circumstances, or if there were rumors of marital discord or even abuse, the surviving spouse might face scrutiny and suspicion, making it harder to find a new partner. A widower who had treated his first wife poorly might find his reputation preceding him, making reputable families hesitant to offer their daughters. Similarly, a widow suspected of complicity in her husband's death would face social ostracism and severe legal consequences. Finally, the Church had specific rules regarding remarriage. While it generally permitted remarriage for widows and widowers, it did not look upon it with the same spiritual favor as a first marriage. Widows, in particular, were often encouraged to remain chaste or to enter religious life. However, for practical and social reasons, remarriage was common and accepted, especially if it contributed to the stability of the family or estate. The judgment from society was less about spiritual purity and more about the practical implications of a second marriage, especially how it affected land, wealth, and the often complicated relationships between step-parents, step-children, and children from multiple unions. The dynamics of existing family units, both immediate and extended, often determined the perceived success and societal approval of these subsequent marital choices. Number 6. Age difference. The age difference between prospective spouses in medieval society was a significant factor in how the union was judged, often reflecting the pragmatic realities of the time rather than personal preference. While love might occasionally blossom, marriage was predominantly an economic and social contract, and the age of the partners played a critical role in fulfilling its primary functions, bearing heirs, securing wealth, and cementing alliances. Society scrutinized these age gaps, understanding their implications for power dynamics, succession, and the overall stability of the union. One common and frequently judged scenario involved the marriage of a very young girl. Sometimes as young as 12, the canonical age of consent for girls, to a significantly older man. This was particularly prevalent among the nobility and royalty, where daughters were valuable pawns in dynastic games. A powerful lord or king might seek a young wife to ensure she had many years of childbearing ahead, increasing the likelihood of producing multiple heirs, especially sons. Such a union was often judged by society as a sensible and strategic move, ensuring the continuation of the lineage and the consolidation of power. For example, Isabella of Angoulême, likely still a teenager, was married to the much older King John of England in 1200. This marriage, while perhaps shocking by modern standards, was a strategic alliance aimed at solidifying John's claim to Aquitaine and enhancing his prestige. Society accepted such arrangements as a necessary part of the aristocratic political landscape, even if the personal dynamics might have been difficult. The criticism, if any, would focus on the effectiveness of the union in producing heirs or cementing alliances, rather than on the age gap itself. Conversely, a young man might marry an older woman, particularly a wealthy widow. This scenario, while less common for first marriages, was often judged as a shrewd economic decision for the man, allowing him to gain access to her dower lands and resources, thereby improving his social standing. The older woman, in turn, might gain protection, companionship, or a means to manage her estates more effectively. However, if the older woman was past childbearing age, the marriage would be judged as primarily a financial arrangement, and if the man was expected to produce heirs for his own lineage, he might later seek an annulment or take a mistress to secure an heir. For instance, the marriage of Geoffrey Chaucer, the renowned poet, to Philippa de Rothe, who was likely older than him and already connected to the powerful Duke of Lancaster, was probably judged as a beneficial match for Chaucer, opening doors to patronage and advancement within the royal court. Marrying a spouse who was considered too old for their station or purpose also faced societal judgment. If a king or a high-ranking noble married a woman well past her childbearing years when he had no legitimate heirs, this decision would be met with severe criticism. Such a union would be seen as irresponsible and a threat to the realm's future, potentially leading to succession crises. This was the case for many monarchs who remarried late in life, and the absence of new heirs often led to intense political machinations around the succession. The idea of love matches between individuals of similar age, while not entirely absent, was less common and often relegated to the lower echelons of society, where land and lineage were less critical. For peasants and common folk, age differences might be less extreme, as their marriages were more often about practical partnerships for labor and household management. A young man might seek a slightly older, experienced wife to run his household, or a young woman might marry a slightly older man who had already established himself with a small plot of land. These unions were judged on their ability to create a functional and productive household unit rather than on grand dynastic aspirations. Ultimately, society's judgment on age difference in medieval marriages was rarely about emotional compatibility. It was about functionality. Could the union produce heirs, consolidate wealth, strengthen alliances, or provide a stable household? A large age gap was acceptable, even desirable, if it served these practical purposes. It was only when an age difference hindered these goals, particularly the production of legitimate heirs, that it became a source of significant negative judgment, threatening the stability of families, lineages, and even kingdoms. Number 5. Physical appearance and health. In the medieval world, while romantic ideals of beauty existed, the judgment of a prospective spouse's physical appearance and health was rooted in pragmatism and stark realities, particularly concerning their ability to produce heirs and maintain a robust household. A person's physical form was not merely a matter of personal attractiveness, but a public statement about their lineage, their capacity for essential duties, and their potential for disease. Society scrutinized these aspects with a clinical eye, understanding that the health of a spouse directly impacted the future of a family line, especially among the nobility, where healthy heirs were paramount. For women, the primary physical judgment centered on signs of fertility and the capacity for childbearing. A robust, well-proportioned body was desirable, as it was believed to indicate good health and a strong potential for bearing many children, particularly sons. A woman who appeared frail, sickly, or physically underdeveloped might be viewed with apprehension, as her ability to carry pregnancies to term or survive childbirth was questionable. Physical deformities, no matter how minor, could be a serious impediment to marriage, as they were often superstitiously linked to divine displeasure or a corrupt lineage, and there was a fear that such deformities might be passed on to offspring. For instance, a noble family would hesitate to accept a bride with a noticeable limp or a severe hunchback, as these physical traits could suggest underlying health issues, or even be seen as an ominous sign for the future of their dynasty. The emphasis was on a healthy, fertile body, not just for procreation, but also for the physical demands of managing a household and raising a family. For men, physical strength and a healthy constitution were important, especially for those in military or agricultural roles. A knight needed to be strong enough to wield a sword and wear armor, a peasant robust enough to work the fields. A man who appeared weak, sickly, or suffering from a chronic illness might be deemed less capable of fulfilling his martial or labor duties. Visible signs of disease, such as leprosy or the lingering effects of the plague, were severe deterrents. Leprosy, in particular, led to complete social ostracism and legal exclusion, making marriage impossible. Even less severe but noticeable ailments, like persistent coughs or a sallow complexion, could suggest a fragile constitution, raising concerns about their longevity and ability to provide for a family. A young lord with a reputation for being sickly or prone to incapacitating fevers might find it difficult to secure a match with a powerful family, as they would worry about his ability to rule and produce robust heirs. Fertility, though unseen, was perhaps the most crucial aspect of health judged in a spouse, particularly for noble and royal families. The failure to produce children, especially sons, was a grave matter that could lead to immense societal pressure, annulment, or dynastic crisis. While the medieval understanding of biology was limited, a prolonged lack of children in a marriage would lead to speculation about the fertility of one or both partners. In most cases, the blame for barrenness often fell upon the woman, seen as barren or unfruitful. A woman who failed to produce heirs regardless of her other qualities might be judged as having failed her primary marital duty. This could lead to a king seeking an annulment from a queen who failed to bear a male heir, as seen in the notorious case of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, where Catherine's inability to produce a surviving son, rather than her health or appearance, became the ultimate judgment that led to their divorce. Even aspects of physical appearance that seem minor today were subject to judgment. Cleanliness, while often challenging in medieval times, was a sign of respectability. Basic hygiene, or the lack thereof, could influence a person's social standing and desirability. Moreover, the general bearing and demeanor of a person were also considered aspects of their physical presentation. Someone who carried themselves with confidence and grace was generally perceived more favorably than someone who appeared awkward or unkempt. Ultimately, the judgment on a medieval spouse's physical appearance and health was a complex calculation of observable traits, underlying health, and societal expectations regarding procreation and capability, all woven into the fabric of a world where survival and lineage were paramount. Number 4. Religious piety and observance. In the deeply religious medieval world, where the Church held immense authority over daily life and spiritual well-being, a prospective spouse's religious piety and adherence to Christian doctrine were subject to intense scrutiny and profound judgment. Marriage was not just a legal contract, but a sacred sacrament blessed by God and overseen by the Church. To marry someone who was deemed impious, heretical, or otherwise spiritually unsound was to invite divine displeasure, societal condemnation, and potentially eternal damnation. This judgment applied to all social strata, from peasant to king, shaping who could marry whom and under what circumstances. One of the most fundamental judgments was whether a prospective spouse was a Christian. Marrying outside the Christian faith was strictly forbidden by the Church and was viewed with extreme disapproval by society. Such unions were often deemed invalid, their children illegitimate, and the Christian partner faced excommunication. For example, a Christian lord marrying a Muslim princess, even for political gain, would have been almost unthinkable within Christian Europe during the Crusades, and would have incurred severe ecclesiastical and social censure. Such marriages were only considered in the most extreme political circumstances, and usually involved conversion of the non-Christian party, as was sometimes the case in the borderlands of Spain or the Baltic. Pressure to marry within the faith was immense, ensuring a shared spiritual foundation for the family and community. Beyond simply being Christian, a prospective spouse's level of piety and observance was also judged. Someone who regularly attended Mass, confessed their sins, received communion, and demonstrated a genuine commitment to Christian virtues would be considered a more desirable partner. This was especially true for women, who were often seen as the spiritual anchors of the household, responsible for the moral upbringing of children. A woman known for her devotion and charity would enhance her family's reputation and attract suitors from equally devout families. Conversely, a person known for their lax religious practices, for missing Mass, or for exhibiting sinful behavior, such as excessive gambling, drunkenness, or open licentiousness, would be viewed with suspicion and scorn. Their lack of piety could suggest a moral failing that extended beyond the spiritual realm, making them an undesirable partner. The existence of monastic vows was another critical aspect of religious judgment. Once a person had taken holy vows to become a monk or a nun, they were considered spiritually married to God, and any attempt to marry a layperson was considered a grave sin and a violation of sacred oaths. Such a union would be immediately condemned by the Church as invalid and would lead to severe penalties, including excommunication for all involved. Society would also view such an act as deeply immoral and sacrilegious. Historical accounts are filled with cases of individuals attempting to escape monastic life for marriage, only to be forcibly returned to their religious houses by ecclesiastical authorities, or their own families keen to uphold the family's honor and avoid divine retribution. Heresy was perhaps the most damning judgment of all. In an era where deviation from orthodox Christian belief was considered a mortal danger to the soul and a threat to social order, anyone accused or convicted of heresy was an absolute pariah. Marriage to a heretic was unthinkable. It was viewed as consorting with an enemy of God and the Church. Such a union would be dissolved immediately, the Christian partner potentially excommunicated, and any children would face severe discrimination. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France, which sought to stamp out Catholicism, saw countless marriages dissolved and families shattered based on accusations of heresy, illustrating the dire consequences of such a judgment. Ultimately, a prospective spouse's religious piety and observance were critical components of their overall societal worth. They reflected not just personal belief, but also a person's adherence to the fundamental moral and social order of the medieval world. To be deemed pious and orthodox was to be considered a respectable and trustworthy individual, capable of contributing to a stable and God-fearing family unit. To fall short in this regard was to face the very real threat of social ostracism, ecclesiastical censure, and the complete impossibility of a respectable marriage. Number 3. Family reputation and alliances. In medieval society, an individual was rarely judged in isolation. Their identity, standing, and future were intrinsically linked to their family. This was especially true when it came to marriage, which was seen primarily as a strategic tool to enhance or protect the collective interests of the lineage. Therefore, a prospective spouse's family reputation and their family's network of alliances were paramount considerations, subject to intense scrutiny and judgment by society. To marry into a family with a good name was to gain prestige, security, and access to powerful connections. To marry into a disreputable or declining family, however, was to risk social ruin, economic instability, and even physical danger. The good name of a family encompassed several crucial aspects. It included their history of loyalty to their overlords, their military prowess, their financial solvency, and their moral standing. A family with a long and distinguished history of service to the crown, or one renowned for its honorable conduct in battle and administration, would be highly sought after as marriage partners. For example, a powerful English baronial family, like the House of Percy or the Neville family, with their vast landholdings and proven military capabilities, were considered prime marriage material for other aristocratic houses. Their reputation ensured not just wealth, but also political influence and protection. Marrying into such a family promised a secure future and elevated status for the incoming spouse and their own family. Conversely, a family with a tarnished reputation was meticulously avoided. If a family had a history of disloyalty, treason, or rebellion against their liege lord, any potential spouse would be wary. Such a connection could bring the wrath of the king or powerful nobles down upon the newly formed union, leading to confiscation of lands, imprisonment, or even execution. The Wars of the Roses in England, for instance, saw families rise and fall with alarming speed. Marrying into a family that backed the losing side could spell disaster, as their lands might be forfeited and their members attainted, making any marriage connection a dangerous liability. Society judged such choices as reckless and detrimental to one's own safety and prospects. Feuds and rivalries between families were also critical considerations. Medieval Europe was rife with long-standing animosities, fueled by land disputes, honor slights, or past betrayals. Marrying into a family that was currently embroiled in a bitter feud could mean inheriting enemies, becoming entangled in violent conflicts, and facing constant danger. However, paradoxically, marriage was also seen as the ultimate means to end a feud. A marriage between two rival families, often involving a daughter from one side marrying a son from the other, was a common strategy to forge a peace treaty and transform animosity into kinship. Such a union, though fraught with tension, would be judged by society as a courageous and necessary step towards stability, especially if it brought an end to protracted local warfare. The famous rivalry between the houses of Montague and Capulet in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, while fictionalized, perfectly illustrates the societal judgment that peace could be forged through marriage, albeit often at a high personal cost. The existing network of alliances a family maintained was equally important. A family with strong, well-established alliances with powerful lords, wealthy merchants, or even the church offered a prospective spouse a vital safety net and opportunities for advancement. These alliances could provide military support in times of war, financial aid in times of need, or political leverage in disputes. Marrying into a family with weak or non-existent alliances, or worse, with a reputation for breaking their word to allies, would be seen as a precarious choice, potentially isolating the new couple from crucial support systems. Ultimately, the judgment on a prospective spouse's family reputation and alliances was a complex calculation of benefits and risks. It was about assessing the collective strength, honor, and reliability of the lineage. An individual's personal qualities were secondary to the broader strategic implications of connecting two family houses. To make the right choice was to secure a future of stability, prosperity, and influence, To make the wrong choice was to invite uncertainty, danger, and social condemnation. Number 2. Wealth and property. In medieval society, where the vast majority of people lived close to the margins of subsistence and economic security, was a constant struggle. Wealth and property were utterly foundational considerations in the choice of a spouse. Far from being a romantic ideal, marriage was fundamentally an economic transaction, a merger of assets and resources designed to ensure survival, consolidate power, or improve social standing. Society judged a marriage, sometimes brutally, on its economic viability and the financial benefits it brought to both families involved. The amount of land, goods, and money exchanged or promised was often the single most critical factor in determining a match's desirability. For the bride's family, the primary concern was the dowry, a transfer of property or money from her family to the groom's upon marriage. The size of the dowry directly reflected the bride's worth in the marriage market and her family's ability to support her. A large dowry could attract a higher status groom, ensuring their daughter a more secure future and elevating the family's prestige. For instance, a wealthy merchant's daughter in a bustling trade city like Florence might bring an enormous dowry of gold florins, valuable silks, and urban properties, making her an attractive match for a cash-poor noble struggling to maintain his estates. Conversely, a family with little to no dowry to offer would find it exceedingly difficult to arrange a good match for their daughter, limiting her choices to men of very low status or potentially no marriage at all. Society judged a small dowry as a sign of weakness or poverty, reflecting poorly on the bride's family and reducing her prospects. For the groom's family, the concern was the dower, which was the provision for the bride in case she became a widow. This was typically a portion of the groom's estate, often 1/3 of his lands, set aside for her use during her lifetime. Promise of a substantial dower was a sign of the groom's wealth and his family's commitment to her future security. However, the groom's family also carefully assessed the bride's dowry to ensure it was a good investment. They expected the dowry to be commensurate with their own status and the resources they were bringing to the union. A wealthy lord marrying a woman with a meager dowry would be judged as a poor strategic decision, diminishing his family's wealth. Land was the most coveted form of property. For the nobility, marriage was often a means to consolidate existing landholdings, acquire new territories, or resolve boundary disputes without resorting to warfare. The marriage of a landed heiress, a woman who stood to inherit significant estates due to the lack of male heirs, was a particularly sought-after prize. Her hand would be contested fiercely by ambitious lords and kings, as her marriage meant the absorption of her lands into her husband's domain. The marriage of Isabella of France to Edward II of England, while tumultuous personally, was politically and economically significant for both realms, bringing together vast territories and resources. Society judged such unions based on the strategic acquisition of land and the power it conferred. Beyond land, other forms of wealth, such as money, goods, and rights, were also crucial. Merchants, for example, might prioritize a spouse from a family with extensive trade networks, access to valuable commodities, or significant liquid assets. Craftsmen might seek a spouse who brought a valuable tool collection, a well-placed workshop, or specific artisanal skills. Even among peasants, the ability to bring a few extra animals, tools, or a well-worked plot of land into the marriage could significantly impact a couple's chances of survival and prosperity. Poor peasant with no assets would struggle to find a partner, as they offered little in terms of economic contribution to a new household. The judgment on wealth and property extended to the long-term implications of the union. Would the marriage improve the family's standing? Would it provide for future generations? Would it protect existing assets? A marriage that was perceived to be economically unsound, one that brought little wealth or even created debt, would be criticized and seen as a failure. The societal pressure to make a financially advantageous match was immense, shaping virtually every decision in the intricate dance of medieval courtship and ultimately determining the perceived success of the union itself. Number 1. Social status and class. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, where everyone knew their place from king to peasant, social status and class were perhaps the most defining factors in the judgment of a choice of spouse. Marriage was not merely a union of individuals. It was a powerful statement about one's standing within the societal structure, a means to reinforce or sometimes dangerously challenge the existing order. To marry someone of appropriate or ideally higher social standing was to affirm one's position and potentially elevate one's family. To marry below one's station, however, could lead to severe social ostracism, disinheritance, and a profound loss of honor and prestige. Society in its layers of nobility, gentry, clergy, merchants, and peasantry judged these choices with an unwavering gaze. For the aristocracy and royalty, marrying within their own elevated circle was not just a preference, but a necessity. Their power, titles, and lands were inherited through bloodlines, and maintaining the purity of these lines was paramount. A king or a powerful duke would seek a bride from another royal house or a family of comparable standing to secure alliances, avoid internal conflicts, and ensure the legitimacy and prestige of their heirs. For instance, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile was celebrated as a union of two powerful Iberian kingdoms, leading to the unification of Spain. This type of match was judged by society as the epitome of strategic foresight and dynastic responsibility. Marrying a commoner was almost unthinkable for royalty and high nobility, as it would dilute their noble blood, threaten the perception of their divine right to rule, and invite challenges from rivals. Such a union would be seen as a scandalous betrayal of royal duty, and would be met with almost universal condemnation from all social classes. Beneath the highest nobility were the knights, minor gentry, and wealthy burgesses, merchants. They also aimed to marry within or slightly above their social strata. A knight might seek a daughter from a slightly wealthier gentry family to improve his landholdings, or a merchant might marry into a family with established trade routes to expand his business. These unions were judged on their ability to consolidate wealth, enhance local influence, and provide opportunities for social mobility within the established class system. For example, a successful merchant in London might seek to marry his daughter to the son of a minor landed knight, a deliberate attempt to gain a foothold in the gentry class, thereby elevating his family's social standing. This was considered a shrewd and commendable move. The most severe judgment was reserved for those who married significantly below their status. A noblewoman who chose to marry a commoner, or a knight who married a peasant, would face disinheritance, social ruin, and familial rejection. Such a match was seen as a profound dishonor to the family name, a rejection of their lineage, and a squandering of their birthright. The offspring of such unions might also face social stigma and be denied the privileges of their noble parents' bloodline. Sumptuary laws, which dictated what different social classes could wear or own, often reinforced these boundaries, making any breach of social decorum highly visible and subject to public judgment. Even among the peasantry, social status played a role, though on a much smaller scale. A landowning peasant would seek a spouse from a family with a similar holding or useful skills, like a skilled weaver or a sturdy farmhand. A serf, tied to the land, could usually only marry another serf from the same manor, requiring the lord's permission. While their choices were extremely limited by their circumstances, they too aimed for a practical partnership that maintained or slightly improved their meager prospects. Peasant marrying someone from a family with a bad reputation for laziness or lawlessness would be judged negatively, as it could threaten the new couple's ability to survive. The Church, while theoretically promoting the spiritual equality of all souls, generally upheld the social hierarchy, often requiring special dispensations or discouraging marriages that crossed significant class lines. It recognized the importance of social order and property rights, which were intrinsically linked to class divisions. Ultimately, the judgment on a medieval spouse choice was deeply rooted in the rigid class system, where the right marriage reinforced stability and social norms, and the wrong marriage threatened to unravel the very fabric of society itself, leading to profound and often devastating consequences for the individuals involved.